Hello everyone, welcome to this revision video for GCSE History, People's Health, Medieval Times, which is 1250 to 1500. In this video, we're going to look at living conditions in medieval times, things like housing, diet, water and waste. We're going to talk about response to epidemics, and we're going to focus obviously on the Black Death. We're going to think about what medieval people believe caused it and how they responded to it. And then we're going to look at public health. We're going to look at national government. They didn't really do a lot. We're going to look at local government, and particularly London after the Black Death. And we're also going to look at public health in the monasteries, which very much set the standard for public health during this time period. So let's find out more. Okay, so when you're looking at people's health, you need to think about the key themes: impact of living conditions, sometimes known as lifestyles, response to epidemics, and improving public health. Key factors that influence things are beliefs, attitudes and values, local and national government, science and technology, urbanisation, and wealth and poverty. And we're going to be focusing in this video about the medieval times, which is 1250 to 1500. Okay, so in terms of the spec for this, you need to know the characteristics and features of medieval Britain, an overview. You need to know about living conditions, and within that is housing, food, clean water and waste. You need to know about responses to the Black Death, the beliefs the medieval people had for it and the actions they took, and then the approaches to public health in late medieval towns and monasteries. So here's just a reminder of some key words for medieval people's health. A cesspit is a pit or chamber used for collecting human waste. A conduit is a small fountain or water pipe. A coroner, an official who investigates violent or suspicious deaths. Dearth means a lack of food, such as after a poor harvest. An epidemic, a disease that affects a large number of people. Ergotism, a medieval disease caused by eating infected rye bread, very common among poor people. Flagellants, people who whip themselves, e.g. to try and avoid catching the Black Death. Four humours, four liquids that make up the human body, according to Greek doctors, like blood, black bile, yellow bile and phlegm. A gong farmer is a person who cleans out cesspits for a living. Guilds, an organisation responsible for keeping high standards in a particular trade. Latrine, a toilet with no system for flushing. Literal Psalter was a 14th century prayer book. Miasma is an idea that bad smells cause disease. Midden is a dunghill or pile of rubbish. A monastery, a place where monks live and pray, would set the standard for public health during this time. And pottage, a thick vegetable soup. So key features of medieval Britain. Well, in terms of farming and food, most people were peasants who did hard physical work on the land. In some ways that kept them healthy, but there were frequent bad harvests which could lead to famine, like the Great Famine of 1315 to 1316, which killed 10% of the population. Medieval towns were fairly small by today's standards. They were busy, containing guilds, crafts and trades. Towns became very busy on market days, which could lead to the spread of disease. In terms of religion, almost everyone was a Christian and a member of the Catholic Church. Each parish had its own church, and there were many cathedrals and monasteries in larger towns, and monasteries sometimes in isolated areas in the countryside as well. Many people believed that disease was caused by God, often as a punishment for sins. Now, when the Black Death hit England in 1348 to 1349, the price of candles went up, and this shows that people were lighting candles to say prayers to protect themselves against the disease. People had prepared for the Black Death by confessing their sins, going to church, or maybe going on pilgrimage to a place like Walsingham in Norfolk, for example. So another key feature of medieval Britain is the fact that old ideas persist. So the church supported the old ideas of Claudius Galen, who was a Greek doctor in the Roman Empire. This led to the idea of the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile, and that for people to be healthy, these humours had to be in balance with each other. This idea persists throughout the medieval times. Technology is limited, with most things being made by hand. There were water mills and windmills. Printing presses appeared from the 1470s, but had much more impact in the early modern period, 1500 onwards. And there was no understanding of germs, as no microscopes meant germs could not be seen. In terms of government, medieval people were ruled over by kings. Kings were not interested in people's health. Money was mainly used for the benefit of the king and his court. They also used their money to fight wars. So, for example, during the Black Death, King Edward III was still going to war with France during the 100 Years' War, for example. Medieval governments did not see it as their responsibility to look after people's health, so there was very little response from the government to the actual Black Death. 90% of medieval people lived in villages, so most people worked in farming, doing hard physical labour. Peasants would suffer and even starve during bad harvests, and as we've said, 10% of the population died in the Great Famine of 1315, 1316, when the weather basically, lots and lots of rain, had destroyed many crops. So medieval people were mostly Christians. They believed God could punish people by sending disease. For example, the disease ergotism was known as St. Anthony's fire after the Christian saint they believed would cure it. They also believed in ideas such as miasma and the theory of the four humours. Ergotism is actually a disease that's spread by infected rye bread, or by fungus on rye bread, we should say. So let's just look at living conditions in medieval times. So if we compare housing in villages to housing in towns, in villages, the lord of the manor was in charge of the village, lived in a large house. Peasant houses varied in size. Most peasants lived in small, simple huts made of woven sticks and covered in mud. Animals were often brought into homes at night. Open hearths or fireplaces burned in houses with smoke escaping through an opening in thatched roof. There were small windows that had shutters, meaning peasant houses were very dark, and it would have been filled with smoke as well, with all that fire burning in the open hearth. Flooring would be straw or rushes. Most village houses had kitchen gardens to grow vegetables and fruit in. Housing in towns, houses were built close together in the centre of towns, and only the wealthy had gardens. The rich had upper floors that jutted out to provide more floor space, and they did have larger accommodation. Workshops of craftsmen and tradesmen were often part of their homes. People were supposed to clean the drains and streets near their houses, but not everyone did. And as the rich lived close to the poor in towns, it meant that they did try to keep conditions a little bit better, but obviously they were not always successful. So we're just going to talk about water and waste in medieval times. In terms of water, in the countryside, fresh water was obtained from springs or wells or the rivers. Springs were sometimes shared with animals, which meant that water was not always clean. In terms of towns, conduits were lead pipes which brought spring water to some towns. The earliest conduits were built by the church. Water sellers also sold water from leather sacks. In terms of the villages in the countryside, in terms of the waste, villagers, peasants would have a midden, a waste heap in their garden. Cesspits were constructed near some village homes. Waste went into the pit. Moss has been found in cesspits, which showed that they used this as toilet roll. Some peasants might have just had a simple hole in the ground, which they would cover with ash from the fire, or they might just go to the toilet in the woods. Waste was used for fertiliser on the farms, but generally waste in the countryside was less of an issue, simply to do with the fact that there was just less people there. In terms of the towns, the rich might have their own latrine in their homes. Public latrines were put up in market squares, and several people would share them. Some latrines were lined with barrels sunk into the ground, and some had no lining, so waste leaked into the cellars of other houses. Rakers, or sometimes known as muck rakers or scavengers, they removed waste from the towns, including just general waste and debris, but also human waste as well. Now, when cesspits were full, or hopefully before they were totally full, they were cleared by someone called a gong farmer. Now, their job was to take it outside the town walls. Sometimes they could sell it to farmers as fertiliser, so it could be used on the fields, but quite often they simply tipped it into streams, and that made the streams and the rivers a horrible mucky mess and created a lot of horrible pollution. The waste generally in towns was more of an issue because they were overcrowded and they were busy. And of course, there was more waste on market days, and trades such as tanners, butchers and fishmongers created waste, often going into open channels in the streets. Butchers in particular, the entrails and remains of animals and the blood and the guts, they often flowed into these open channels in the streets. Okay, in terms of medieval diet, bread was really important. A good harvest would lead to a plentiful supply of bread, but people could starve in famines. So the Great Famine of 1315, 1316, 10% of the population died. The poor ate a bread called rye bread, which sometimes contained a fungus that could cause a really horrible illness called ergotism, which was known as St. Anthony's fire. This could kill, and it mostly affected poor people, and people believed this was caused by God rather than really being able to link it with rye bread. In terms of drinks, ale and cider. So ale was made by boiling water, which actually killed germs, although medieval people didn't know that, so it was definitely healthier to drink. And barley, which was full of nutrients. Cider was made using apples, and these drinks were healthier than the water in towns. In terms of meat and fish, if people could afford it, they ate a wide variety of meat. The rich consulted guides about how eating meat would affect their humours, which is this idea that the body contains different humours, fluids that can affect your health. The church did not allow meat to be eaten on Fridays, so fish was eaten on Fridays instead. The rich also ate cheese, eggs, nuts and fruit. Honey was used as a sweetener. Some market traders sold rancid meat pies, which were obviously extremely unhealthy. They tried to hide the bad meat within the pie. Now, one of the main sources of food eaten by the poor was pottage. It was a thick vegetable soup, which was widely eaten by medieval peasants, probably their staple food. The diet of ordinary people was fairly limited. Meat, fish, eggs and cheese were luxuries. So in terms of similarity and difference, rich people ate a wide variety of foods than poor people, and they were not affected by famine. But the poor mostly ate pottage. In villages, though, they had kitchen gardens to grow vegetables and fruit, which is obviously not really possible for the poor in towns. Okay, so we're now going to look at responses to epidemics and look at the Black Death of 1348-49. Diseases such as typhoid and dysentery were very common in the Middle Ages, but the Black Death, or known as the plague, or medieval people called it the pestilence, was the worst epidemic, and it hit England in 1348-49, and it killed 50% of the population, which could have been as much as 3 million people. It took 200 years for the population to recover. Now, the Black Death came to England via Asia and Europe along trade routes such as the Silk Road. The plague was mainly spread by fleas living on black rats, but medieval people did not know this. Now, there are really 3 types of plague. There's the bubonic plague, where the main swelling was buboes. There's a fever and high temperature, and blisters, which were fluid-filled, death in a few days. There's the septicemic plague, which involved bleeding, diarrhea and vomiting. Fingers, toes and nose would turn black. Pneumonic plague symptoms, coughing up blood, chest pains and trouble breathing, death in 2 days. Now, medieval people did not understand the causes of the Black Death, so this meant that the approaches they took to deal with it had a very limited impact. So the Black Death, people didn't understand the true cause. Medieval people believed that God was punishing people for their sins. That was the main belief, really. But some even explained it through unusual movement of the planets. Some believed in miasma, an invisible poison in the air that created bad smells. Some believed the poisons were released by earthquakes, these miasma poisons. People got the plague if their humours were out of balance. That's what some people believed, such as eating a poor diet or having too much blood in your body. And some people believed you could catch the plague through eye contact. But the 2 main beliefs really are that God was punishing them, and they believed in this idea of miasma. Now, miasma, this idea that bad smells, invisible poisons in the air create illness, will last all the way until the 19th century. So what treatments did medieval people try? Tying live toads or chickens to the buboes to draw out the disease, bloodletting, removing blood to balance the humours, praying to God for forgiveness, such as lighting a candle, or distancing themselves from others. There are stories of the rich moving to the countryside to find pure air. Lodgers and even children were forced out onto the streets. Now, the government response was really limited. Now, King Edward III, who was the King of England during the Black Death, he wrote a letter in April 1349 to the Mayor of London, and it said in this letter, cause the human feces and other filth lying in the streets and lanes to be removed with all speed to places far distant, and to cause the city and suburbs to be cleansed from all odour and to be kept clean as it used to be in the time of preceding mayors, so that no greater cause of mortality may arise from such smells. This is one of the few government actions that is taken to combat the Black Death. Obviously, this is pretty limited. It's only in London. It's not a massive response. And it's really important in terms of your analysis to know that the response from the government in England was very ineffective, unlike in places like Italy, where they used quarantine and did pass laws to clean up the streets. The plague would return again in 1361, 1362, and there were 20 more outbreaks before 1500. However, the government throughout medieval times did nothing to combat the plague. So how did medieval people protect themselves from the Black Death? Well, some people ran away. This was particularly rich people in towns, moved to the countryside hoping to find pure air. Some priests even ran away. In terms of pure air, people burned herbs like rosemary to purify the air in their houses. People burnt candles, and people carried posies of flowers. Posies like a pocket of flowers or a bunch of flowers. Flagellants were people who whipped themselves in order to try and gain God's forgiveness. The idea was if they whipped themselves, they'd show that they were sorry for their sins, and then God would take away the disease. Now, this was much more common in Europe. A group of flagellants did come to England from Europe, but few English people copied this. The church was really important, and they encouraged people to confess their sins and ask for forgiveness. The king ordered bishops to arrange large processions of priests through cities confessing the nation's sins, which would actually have been a really unhelpful action. Before the Black Death, people went on pilgrimage to places like Walsingham in Norfolk, and they bought holy water to spray on their food, put on their doorways to try and protect them. The prices of candles went up as so many people were buying candles for prayer, and priests delivered last rites, but many priests actually died themselves from the Black Death. Some people shut themselves away in their own homes, believing particularly in things like eye contact, and some householders forced lodgers or even children out onto the streets if they showed any sign of the disease. Okay, so we're now going to look at public health in late medieval towns and monasteries, and we're going to think about how monasteries affected public health. Now, monasteries needed clean water, and this had a huge impact on public health. Religious communities like monasteries, they needed clean water for religious ceremonies, like baptisms, for example, as well as the day-to-day washing of linen and people. It was a Christian duty as well to care for the sick. Cleanliness was seen as being next to godliness. Religious institutions were often rich and powerful, so they could actually pay for water pipes to be laid over long distances to bring pure water from the hills. Some monasteries had hospitals or infirmaries attached to them, and as we've seen there, it was a Christian duty to care for the sick, so they would often look after sick people. Remember though, this is more about hospitality than genuine sort of medical care. So for example, one of the things that they did was they would have 2 patients sharing a bed. But monasteries do set the standard for good public health with clean water. Fountains Abbey is a good example of a medieval monastery. It's in North Yorkshire. They had latrines, for example, over the river, which would take waste away. However, by 1500, monasteries were much less wealthy. Many monasteries were affected actually by the Black Death, and standards in monasteries had dropped by the end of medieval times. So that's a really important focus in terms of change, that we have a changing standard in the quality of public health in monasteries. So we're now going to talk about changes made to public health in towns. Now, as towns grew wealthier, citizens gave money to improve public health instead of the church. Towns grew as respect for the church was in decline. As a result, some wealthy townsmen began to fund the development of new conduits and public toilets. And local government did take action before the Black Death of 1348. By 1500, as we've seen, standards in many monasteries had dropped and respect for the church had somewhat declined. So let's talk about some of the things that towns did before the Black Death. So in terms of the problem of filthy roads and marketplaces, there was paving of marketplaces paid for by taxation. Happened in Shrewsbury in 1301, leading to better trade and ideas, and the idea of this spread to other towns. Dung heaps were moved to the edge of towns. It happened in Bristol and York as well as other towns, linked of course to the idea of miasma, but the actual effect meant there was less chance of bacteria spreading, so it did have a positive impact on health. In terms of dumping waste, name and shaming waste dumpers, that happened in Norwich in 1287 to 1289, and that improved water supplies. And then in terms of poor quality meat, we talked about how there was the problem of selling rancid meat pies. Guilds, which are associations of different trades, representing different trades, guilds of food producers set standards and fined producers who did not meet them. This happened in Winchester in 1329, leading to safer meat and safer food. Okay, so after the Black Death, London led the way in public health. It provided piped water to its people since the 1230s. Despite the Black Death, its population grew from 25,000 in 1250 to 100,000 in 1500. The Lord Mayor of London and the aldermen were responsible for keeping the city healthy. Now, guilds also had an increasingly important role in public health and raising standards of health within different trades. So different trades at the time, like tanners or butchers or fishmongers, they would have a guild that would represent them, and in order to trade in that, you'd have to be part of the guild, and they would kick people out if they had low standards. So let's have a look at some specific actions in London after the Black Death. So in the year 1385, a warden was appointed to check whether London's streets and the banks of the River Thames were clear of filth and dunghills. In 1415, the Mayor of London ordered the rebuilding of a latrine at Moorgate because it had been flooding neighbouring properties with sewage. In the 1430s, the Mayor of London, John Wells, extended the pipes that supplied London with clear spring water. He and other rich citizens left money in their wills to improve water supplies and build new latrines, their toilets. 1478, London expelled toyers, which were animal skinners, for dumping waste into the Thames, but that actually had the effect of just moving the problem to the suburbs of London. In 1479, gong farmers in London formed their own guild to repair road surfaces and cesspits. Gong farmers tend to be well paid. And in 1488, Londoners called for butchery to be banned from the city. It led to the Butchers Guild building expensive underground passage to carry water from the Shambles, which is the place where animals were killed, to the River Thames. Okay, thanks for watching that revision video about people's health, medieval times, 1250 to 1500 for OCR GCSE history, and good luck with your exams. Bye-bye.